Yeah, thank you for welcoming. And the title of my essay I'm going to share with you is Theopaschism and Trinitarian Wisdom. Moltmann's and Wolfhard Pannenberg's Trinitarian Engagement in Theology-Science Dialogue. Okay. In this paper, I argue that the question of how the triune God relates to suffering shapes not only Christology and a Trinitarian doctrine, but also theology and science dialogue. The contemporary resurgence of debates on Theopaschism, namely whether one of the Trinity suffered on the cross, is relevant to the notion of divine action in creation, including the non-human sphere that's universally marked by death, entropy, pain, and suffering. I approach Theopaschism not only as a doctrine of the Son's suffering, but as a Trinitarian interpretive lens for understanding divine action within the suffering in the history of creation. In this regard, Pannenberg and Moltmann offer two profoundly influential but contrasting approaches. Pannenberg develops a non-Theopaschitic Trinitarian theology that places the cross within the Son's self-differentiation from the Father, while Moltmann argues for a Theopaschitic vision of God's compassionate and co-suffering immanence. Their divergence bears major implications for how theology engages natural sciences. Pannenberg prioritizes rational coherence grounded in God's gradual and eschatological self-revelation. Moltmann emphasizes divine solidarity with creation's woundedness. This article therefore seeks a constructive synthesis, arguing that Pannenberg's commitment to rational comprehensiveness and Moltmann's emphasis on compassionate divine immanence together offer a richer Trinitarian theology of creation for theology and science dialogue. Now I begin with Pannenberg's scheme. First of all, Pannenberg's theology of creation is based on the hypothesis of God as the all-determining reality and the principle of sub ratione Dei, which situates all historical events in relation to the concept of God. Rejecting Karl Barth's bilateral scheme of theology and other disciplines and modern Protestant subjectivism, Pannenberg proposes that theology and natural sciences stand together within the holistic search for the intelligibility of reality. In his book, Systematic Theology, Volume 1, and the Metaphysics and the Idea of God, he argues that the philosophical quest for the unity of meaning ultimately converges with the Trinitarian conception of God. Theology becomes the unifying discipline that integrates diverse fields of knowledge by interpreting the universe as the history of God's self-revelation. In so doing, Pannenberg engages the emergence of monotheism and Trinitarian monotheism in the evolution of religions. He seeks to render the triune God as the ontological ground of all created beings and presents the locus of the Christian faith as the venue for rational coherence among disciplines. In this theological scheme, Pannenberg understands creatio ex nihilo as God's ruling of a finite, contingent, and entropic cosmos in which order, complexity, life, and consciousness, as well as death and decay, entailing pain and suffering, coexist in ambiguity. Entropy reflects both the creative openness and the limits of finite existence, while death, pain, and suffering emerge contingently in the finite universe as natural evil. They are inevitable for the birth of new lives and higher complexity. They are neither directly caused nor willed by God, but arise as the shadow side of God's creation due to the creaturely finitude. God, as the ground of creaturely possibilities, assumes redemptive responsibility through creatio continua. The Father and the Son relationship in self-differentiation and in unity grounds genuine creaturely independence. The Spirit functions as the field of creation that unifies and actualizes God's creation's movement as the work of the Son towards the totality of meaning and coherence among the emergent novelties. The Spirit works in creation from the horizon of the eschatological fulfillment that was promised in the resurrection of Jesus, the Son incarnate. In the unthematized and thematized anticipation of the ever-receding horizon of God's future, creatures emerge and evolve in their finitude and contingency. In that way, the eschaton works proleptically within the present without collapsing history into determinism. The creation of the universe is Trinitarian, and at the center lies the cross of Jesus, the Son incarnate. Namely, Pannenberg situates the cross of Jesus as the apex of the Son's self-differentiation from the Father, while the Spirit serves as the bond of the unity of the Father and the Son and all unifying field of life. Pannenberg honors the traditional Chalcedonian two-nature Christology. On the cross, the one person of the Son truly dies in his human reality, yet not in his divine nature, thus avoiding reverse monophysitism. The Father co-suffers sympathetically with the Son on the cross in his human reality only. The Spirit pledges the resurrection as the triumph over death, sin, and evil. In strict sense, Pannenberg's view of the Trinity is Theopaschistic, but I see this as with non-Theopaschistic bent. This non-Theopaschistic bent informs his theology and science dialogue. Natural sciences investigate the mechanism of natural causes, while theology seeks the ultimate unity of reality in the Trinitarian creation that gradually unfolds. Pannenberg does not center the transformative tension that lies in conflicts between the present moment and the future of God's eschatological kingdom. He rather focuses on the revelatory and cognitive dimension of creatio continua. For Pannenberg, the presence of evil means the absence of divine truth within the history of creation. The revelation of God's truth remains open to revision till the horizon of the eschatological future is fulfilled. In this light, Pannenberg envisions theology as participating in rational search for universality, intelligibility. Revelation unfolds historically through the unity of natural and human processes. Philosophy of science paves the way for interdisciplinary dialogue by identifying both the continuities and unique features of different branches of natural science. Theology, in turn, situates scientific inquiries within the larger question of the ultimate meaning, the teleology of creation, where they all find coherence as God's own creation. This framework subtly contrasts with Moltmann's. Moltmann shares Pannenberg's interest in the history of revelation, but centers his theology on God's compassionate and co-suffering presence amidst the death and the suffering of creatures. It is not exceptional to his theology of creation and approaches to dialogue with natural sciences. For Moltmann, entropy is both the condition of life's dynamism and the source of creation's metaphysical sadness or death. Creaturely finitude itself is not evil, but enables creaturely independence, openness, and contingency. Evil emerges through creaturely misuse of the freedom and contingency. Those evils will be overcome in the new creation. Also, the physical death of creatures as part of the fallen finitude is destined for eschatological overcoming when the true creaturely finitude is fulfilled in relation to God and other creatures. While distinguishing his view from Patripassianism, Moltmann's theology frames the cross of Jesus as the locus of the Trinitarian suffering. Jesus' death is the death of the person of the Son, while the eternal Son experiences death. The Son overcomes it through the Father's raising and the breath of the Spirit. Son experiences abandonment, and Father experiences the loss of the fatherhood, and the Spirit shared co-suffering as the Spirit of the Father and the Son. Son's immanence is therefore theopaschistic, a co-suffering solidarity that transforms creation from within. Whereas Pannenberg stresses scientific rationality through coherent explanation that will be perfected in the eschaton, Moltmann emphasizes the ethical and liberative responsibilities that accompany scientific knowledge and theological pursuit of God's truth. Moltmann interprets creation's history as contingent and emergent, with God granting creaturely freedom through Zimzum according to the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, which means self-restriction that allows both novelty and the risk of death and suffering. This moment is equivalent to creatio ex nihilo, that is an unmediated act of God giving birth to mediated creation, or creatio continua, that entails the contingent but inevitable presence of death, pain, and suffering across the board in the universe. The cross of Jesus, the Son incarnate, reveals the Trinitarian participation in the world's suffering in different modes. And his resurrection promises fulfillment through completion and renewal. This grounds Moltmann's interdisciplinary disciplinary enterprise. He starts theology and science dialogue from ethical crisis in ecology and climate change and the ethical challenges arising from biomedicine's development, arguing that scientific inquiries must be guided by theological and ethical reflections. Here, divine immanence as compassionate solidarity, not merely progressive revelation, shapes his approach. Moltmann points to the ecological and climate crisis and biomedical advancements as areas requiring collaborative discernment. He points out that scientific progress is never value neutral. Human hopes and fears shape research agendas. As his examples of German nuclear physicists during the World War II illustrate how science can be co-opted by political interests. However, furthermore, research in science starts from scratch with certain ethical, political, and economic purposes. Thus, theology is called to contribute by providing the interpretive lens for nature as God's creation, where God continues to work creatively and redemptively through compassion and providing hope for God's kingdom. Theology can provide ethical orientation to scientific pursuit of the common good, while natural sciences inform the Christian theology of creation. Now I turn to a constructive synthesis of the two figures' perspectives. Starting with their understanding of the cross, I propose a theopaschistic yet redemptive immanence of God in creation. Albert Camus rejected a God who uses evil for divine purposes. This critique resonates to Moltmann. A good God may bring good out of evil, but evil itself should never be part of God's desire. In that sense, the cross can be understood not as God's use of violence, but as God's protest against evil. Here, God's protest is not in the Manichaean sense. God does not wage warfare with evils. Rather, God eradicates evils as the triune one who will eventually triumph over the power of death, as the one who created the world ex nihilo. Yet, the Son participates in creaturely pain, suffering, and death. The Father suffers the loss of the Son. The Spirit co-suffers as the bond of the love. This Trinitarian compassion becomes liberative as a protest to evils in the light of Jesus' resurrection. For Moltmann, the important point here is that if God is infinite love, divine compassion must expand into the participation in creaturely sufferings. I see that Moltmann may resonate with Pannenberg's scheme, even though Pannenberg's scheme is with non-theopaschistic bent. However, the cross as the climax of the Son's self-distinction from the Father may imply deep compassion in the Father and the Spirit, who have eternally indwelt the Son. The life of the Son reveals reciprocal indwelling. Thus, the Son's crucifixion cannot be limited to his human reality, but is meaningful to the eternal Son. Martin Luther writes that God so loved us to be willing to pay the price of his only dearest child, him he sent into our misery, hell and death, and let him drain these to drag. In his idea of communicatio idiomatum, Luther affirms that God in his nature cannot die. However, now that God and man are united in one person, it is called God's death, when the man who dies is one substance or one person with God. Likewise, the Spirit participates in compassion in divine reality too. The Finnish-American Lutheran theologian Veli-Matti Karkkainen astutely writes that the Spirit after Easter is the Spirit of the crucified, risen Christ. Here, the two different construals of God's hiddenness and revealedness in the history of the present creation become crucial. For Pannenberg, hiddenness is tied to the futurity of revelation. God's deity remains veiled because only the eschaton will manifest it fully. Thus, historical processes exhibit proleptic openness, bearing anticipatory signs of divine reality despite its incompleteness. History functions as an indirect medium of revelation. By contrast, Moltmann understands divine hiddenness as God's compassionate participation in the world's suffering. Despite these differences, both theologians regard the history of creation as a mediated and indirect revelation of God's truth. The proposed Trinitarian ontology now invites diverse disciplines to work together without premature judgments about the truth of God and in solidarity with those who are oppressed in creation. Theologians and scientists alike are called into collaborative, open-ended inquiry for the flourishing of creation, with an urgent awareness of the mission to preserve God's creation. Modern natural sciences gleaned foundational inspirations about contingency and rational intelligibility of nature from creation, Christian doctrine of creatio ex nihilo. This influence is especially evident in early modern figures such as Robert Boyle, and it shaped the broader intellectual milieu in which scientists like Copernicus and Galileo pursued their work. Augustine affirmed that reason and faith are complementary. Pannenberg and Moltmann share this interdisciplinary openness too. Considering the contemporary developments such as gene therapies and gene germline copy and paste technologies, as well as the compassionate program offering experimental treatment to terminally ill patients, show how science can embody compassion for those oppressed with incurable disease. Conversely, there are looming risks of abuses. Look at the heated argument over CRISPR baby case and see how the problem of genetic commodification show that scientific innovations can endanger the dignity of humans and natural environment. Furthermore, according to Yuval Harari, the AI raises new concerns by decoupling intelligence from consciousness, neglecting that consciousness emerges from the history of our bodily evolution. Harari's warning highlights the urgency of valuing the ecologically interwoven nature of our body and consciousness. I contend that Pannenberg's pursuit of intellectual coherence among disciplines helps by valuing each level of created reality, physical, biological, psychological, and social dimensions, as all of them constitute human and non-human bodies and consciousness. In light of these advantages and dangers of scientific advancements, Pannenberg offers methodological rigor for interdisciplinary research. Moltmann brings ethical urgency and ecological concern by emphasizing participation in the mission for the kingdom of God. Together, they open the new horizons of the Trinitarian theology of creation by affirming both intelligibility and the compassionate messianic mission for God's creation's flourishing. Thank you for your attention.